Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. It's Alan, the Comic Collector Geek, and this is going to be a video where I'm going to show you 5 books that really changed comic book history as we know it. These are major books that played a very historical or pivotal role in the way we appreciate comics and the types of people that collect comics and the whole market in general. So these are pretty major books. I'm going to go through without really a particular order. I'm just going to show you some cool books, and I'm going to show you 5 major books that impacted comic history. The first one is one that most people might not even know about. And for such a major book in terms of historical significance, it's one that is probably the least well known on the list. And it's Young Romance #1. And this book is actually quite a rare book. It's not one that most people would even have on the radar as a big book to pick up and, oh, this is a historical book. But it is. It is actually very important because this is the very first romance comic. And you might think, oh, well, romance, who reads romance? Well, lots of people read romance books, mainly girls. And it was, this is the book that kept girls into reading comics because it spawned a whole bunch of, copycats. Like there was like so many similar comics that came out as a result of this one that really fueled the romance comic book industry. And it was a huge industry. There was hundreds and hundreds of titles that were romance books. And, but this book was the one that started it all. So it's the first comic devoted to romance. And, yeah. And the interesting thing about romance books is a lot of the genres of comics kind of faded out after the Golden Age. Romance was one of those things that stayed strong even till this day. This is one of those genres that still exists in different forms. It sort of petered out mainly in the 70s, like where it was still fairly popular. It's because comics have kind of pushed more and more just for boys, and not even for kids, but just for like men even. The romance genre sort of faded because the nobody was supporting it. But during the, like from the late 40s all the way up into the late 70s, romance was in its own sort of space and had been very successful. So Young Romance #1, major comic book for comic book history. The next one is an interesting one. This is a Bronze Age book that really could be one of those books that you say, well, actually started the Bronze Age. There's other books that have been sort of flagged as being the ones that started the Bronze Age, but this one in some way deserves some of the credit too. This is Spider-Man 96. And the thing that's special about this is it actually is missing something that pretty much all the comics at this time had. And it's the Comic Code Authority stamp right here. It doesn't have it. And the reason it doesn't have it is the Comic Code Authority set out very strict rules of what was allowed in comics. And one of the things that was not allowed was anything drug related. Like you couldn't show drug usage, you couldn't show drug abuse, you couldn't show anything like that. And this book really wanted to address the drug epidemic at the time. There was in the early 70s, there was a real problem with drug usage in the US and people were dying. And Stan Lee wanted to address it and have a story based on it. And he thought, why not? And they did try to get it to be approved by the Comic Code Authority, but it was not. So he said, well, screw it. I'm going to publish it anyways. And this book actually kind of represents the first push back, against the Comic Code Authority, where it was really saying, hey, look, we're not going to, we want to write the stories that we're interested in and that our readers want. And we're not going to follow by the code. And this book kind of marks that gradual breakdown of the Comic Code that still lasted another 40 years, but it was the first major blow to the Comic Code Authority, and is a major book for the Bronze Age. So yeah, just a very important book for the comic book history. So Spider-Man 96, the drug issue. Okay, this next one is an interesting one. This is the book that saved Marvel. So basically what happened was Marvel was a big company, even in the Golden Age. But really, it was dying. it was kind of on its last legs, we'll say. What happened was, after the Golden Age, it sort of moved out of superheroes. It kind of gave up on superheroes. It moved into good girl, humor, and a lot of monster books. And not really the best stories. It would be the same story over and over again at the end of the day. I mean, they were fun in their own right. How many times can you use multiple consonants to name a monster? Well, Marvel tested that very thesis with its monsters. It came up with Arg and Org and Zerk, some Tor. It was like some really weird names to try to come up with new monsters. But after a while, that gets pretty boring. How many times is the world gonna be at the end of days, and yet there's another comic that comes out next week? It was just getting repetitive, and people were getting bored of it, and the sales were suffering at Marvel. And it looked like the writing was on the wall for Marvel. At the time, it was called Atlas or Timely, and it looked like things were going to go downhill. However, there was a comic that came out of DC called Flash through Showcase. They had Showcase, and Flash was very successful. So Marvel thought, hey, maybe we can bring back superheroes into our comics. We can get around the Comic Code Authority, and we can bring back superheroes and maybe one last kick at the can and see if we can make it a success. And they came out with a different form of superheroes than had been used in the past. What they brought was the Fantastic Four and a dysfunctional family. So in the past, superheroes were really based on either solo characters or teams, and there was no real connection between the characters. Well, this is really a family, and they call this the first Marvel family, where it was a group of characters really based around that family feeling, and maybe a dysfunctional family, and they focus not on just the hero and their heroic efforts, but the interaction between the characters. And you really get that sort of family feeling with goods and bads parts of that family. And that's really what made this book successful, that it appealed to young readers who could say, oh, I can relate to those characters and their troubles. So this was one that really changed Marvel's trajectory from being almost bankrupt to becoming a successful franchise again. So Fantastic Four changed history and made Marvel the dominant player in the Silver Age. So really the Silver Age became the Marvel Age. And they named the company Marvel. And it took off. And they released other superhero titles like X-Men and Spider-Man and Hulk, Iron Man, and a whole bunch of like Daredevil, all after this one came out, and they all generally did really, really well. And we had the Marvel becoming one of the dominant players, if not the dominant player for comics after the success of this book. So, a very important book in terms of comic book history. We wouldn't have so many things that we associate with with comics if it wasn't for that one book. Now, this next one is an interesting one because this is not only one that is important for comics, but toys and movies, and it's really like a multi-billion-dollar franchise that was spawned from this one comic. And it's one that actually really created the Copper Age of comics. So I like books that have historical significance that actually set new eras forward. So this one is kind of that thing. And it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1. This book really created not just a new age of comics, but it really set up a new genre of comics, which is anthropomorphic characters. You know, the idea of making turtles ninjas, it was weird, it's quirky. Now, the interesting thing, we might think of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as being for young kids because it's, you know, if you watch the cartoon, it's very child-friendly. Well, the original stories were actually very gritty and violent and gory even. You know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were meant for adults. It was not a kid's book. And it's very, very cool story. So the idea is that, you know, they wanted to do something that's a little quirky, a little bit different, and it worked. Became very, very successful. Launched a series of TV series, and also franchise of toys and merchandise, and several successful movies. Just a huge book, and it also set up so many new characters within the anthropomorphic genre. So, such an important book. As I said, this book really is the one that most people cite as the beginning of the Copper Age of comics. So, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, #1, from 1985. Or 1984, sorry. So yeah, major book. Okay, the last one is one that I've talked about many times in the past. And again, I really do like books that kind of set up different eras. And I've talked about this one many times. And to me, maybe Action 1 would be the pinnacle of historical significant comics. But this one has its place as well. And it is actually one that is well recognized by collectors. And it's one that's well recognized by many to be the book that really changed comics forever. And it's Crime Suspense Stories #22. This book really ended the golden age of comics. So what happened was comics had, by this point, become increasingly more gory and graphic on the covers. And it really was causing a rift within the American population, because there was an activist, Frederick Wortham, who was basically saying, hey, comics are destroying the minds of kids. And he basically created a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. And that book led people to freak out. Like literally, parents were freaking out about comics. And they were saying, well, you know, comics are destroying the youth of America. Look at what they're showing to young kids. Look how they're corrupting the minds of these young kids and making them commit crimes. And it's the reason for the rise of juvenile delinquency. Now, was it really the reason for the rise of juvenile delinquency? Probably not. The theories were very weirdly based. You know, Frederick Wortham, he worked as a psychologist, and he worked with like troubled youth. They all read comics, so therefore they must be. It must be the comics that's causing them to be, youth that are having problems. You know, it was very, very loose in terms of scientific theory. At the time, all kids read comics. It was the thing that kids did. To assume that, that just because they're juvenile delinquents and they read comics, that was the cause of their delinquency is an extreme theory. But he was an activist, and he did get a lot of attention for what he wrote, and so much attention for it that they actually had Senate hearings. And the Senate hearings brought in the publishers to defend their comics. And what they did was they took a picture of this one, blew it up, so everybody could see it. And they asked William Gaines, or Bill Gaines, what he thought about this book. What was his opinion of this comic? And, is it appropriate to show this to kids? And William Gaines, there was kind of an interesting story going on with William Gaines. Right? He was a very heavy-set man, overweight, which at that time was not seen as so normal as it is nowadays. But they really wanted to help him lose the weight. So he was on a weight loss program where he really didn't eat much. And when you don't eat much, you don't necessarily think the clearest. And he was also sitting in trial for a while, as this proceeding was going on. And he was hungry. He was not necessarily as focused as he needed to be. And he didn't come across as well as he could have. So when they asked him about this book, he was very confrontational in the way he responded. And he said, well, look, the axe, it doesn't have, red, it's black. It's so you can't tell that it's blood. And the woman's head is just low enough that you can't tell that it's decapitated. And, he kind of downplayed what was happening on this cover. And as a result, the media was writing notes about what he was saying, and it became the front page story the next day. So much so, and there was so much backlash, that all of the publishers got together and said, okay, we got to do something before the government shuts us down, because it looked like the Senate hearings were not going to go well. The public opinion had shifted against the comic book community and the comic book publishers, so that they had to do something, or they would be all out of business. There would be no more comics. So that was this book. And what happened was they set up the Comic Code Authority as a self-regulating entity that basically created a bunch of rules that made it so that comics like this could no longer exist. They couldn't have gory comics. They couldn't have drug use comics, just as I mentioned before. They couldn't have comics with overt sexuality. They couldn't have comics that showed criminals winning over police. The police always had to win and always had to be shown in a respectful way. They had very strict rules on what comics could and could not do. And as a result, it made it very challenging for comics. There was about 2,000 publishers before the Comic Code Authority came into play, and afterwards, only 200 remained. It really, streamlined the number of companies. It killed a lot of companies, because if you didn't follow the Comic Code Authority's rules, you were not able to distribute your comics. That was the restrictions that the Comic Code Authority put into play. That only comics which bore the Comic Code Authority stamp could be distributed to the newsstands. Huge problem. EC was one of the most hardest hit by this regulations, because things like weird, eerie, certain words weren't even allowed to be used in the titles because they would go against the Comic Code Authority. And a lot of those words were ones that were the titles of EC Comics. And part of the reason for that is the other publishers really saw this as an opportunity to eliminate some competition. The Comic Code Authority was really used as a way to kind of narrow the field. And one of the big players that they wanted to sort of take out was EC Comics. And William Gaines really didn't take an active role in the creation of the Comic Code Authority, and in a way kind of let them sort of steamroll him, and they took advantage of him in such a way that many of the EC comics were no longer able to be published. As a result, EC moved away from publishing comics and went solely into producing magazines. And it focused on Mad Magazine and became very successful. So there was a bright side for EC at the end of it. And that's 5 comics that changed comic book history. If you like this little series, I will do it again with 5 different comics that all had major impacts on comic book history. Tell me if you like this as an idea in the comments below, and I will do more of these. So again, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Bye for now.